All right. Good evening, folks. Or at least it's evening here where I'm doing this. I'm not sure what time it is when you're watching it. But tonight, our first lecture is going to be over delivery methods. So when we talk about delivery methods, what we're talking about is how the construction for the project is delivered. And and not just the construction, I mean the whole project, but really the focus is on uh, the process and the relationships and the various forms that it takes um, that projects get constructed, designed and constructed. There's three key things I want you to keep in mind on this, and this isn't a test question, but just a way to kind of frame a reference for all of you is that team structures create relationships, right? So when you have a team, there's relationships that are involved in between them. When it comes into relationships in these examples where we're talking about the construction of a project, what we're really talking about is these relationships are defined by agreements or contracts. And so the important thing to remember is that those relationships between the owner and the architect, the owner and the contractor, the architect and the contractor, and all the parties involved are defined by agreements or contracts. And then the way these agreements are structured and read create behaviors. And so that's to say that, people, because if they're contracted to do things or to not do things, then they will act accordingly, and that shapes their behaviors. So, while we're going to go over various ways that we can design and construct a project, it's not to say that any one of these is right. In fact, all of these are great methods and ways to deliver projects. Some are more tested than others, and there's definitely advantages and disadvantages of each, which we'll go through as we explore these. So first delivery method that we want to discuss is design, bid, build. And so that's what we spent really that whole last class, all those lectures, the last class talking about is the traditional design, bid, build scenario. And so there are two reasons why design, bid, build is particularly popular and the traditional most preferred method. The first is that there's a competitive bidding process, and so the owner is assured that they are getting the lowest price of the available people to bid the project. The second thing is that they have complete control of the design because the architect, working as their agent during design, makes sure that everything that they want is in the project and therefore in the documents that get bid and hopefully built. So here's a diagram that illustrates this delivery method. So O is owner, A is architect, C is contractor. Okay, and the solid lines represent a relationship or an agreement or a contract, right? So those are lines of contract relationships. So the owner will start out a project by signing a contract or an agreement with the architect. The architect will design the project, and they also have a solid line right here. I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, where they will hire consultants, right? Like we've talked about, you're going to hire a mechanical consultant, an electrical consultant, a structural consultant, whatever it takes to execute the design of the project. Then, once you have done that, you will bid that. And when you bid that, there is this moment of truth, right? Where you know if the project, based on the bids you receive, is within the the owner's budget. If it's not, you may have some changing to do in the drawings in order to accommodate that. If it is, of course, then you will sign the owner would sign an agreement with the contractor. And so that's the relationship shown here in this line. Now, there's not a direct contract between the architect and the contractor in this relationship. In fact, the way that this works is that even when the owner is contracted with a contractor for the construction, the architect still remains an agent of the owner and represents the owner in various capacities that are defined by their contract. Now, because these are two separate contracts, there is another contract document called the A201 General Conditions for Construction. And so the general conditions for construction govern how each of these contracts and the relationship between the architect and the contractor relate to each other. And so what that allows is for a definition and consolidation, not consolidation, an explanation of how all these contracts meld together. And so what the architect does is when they're preparing their project manual, in their front end of the project manual before the specifications, they will include the general conditions and the supplementary general conditions. And so that way the contractor knows the general conditions of the contract that they need to include in their bid. There's an additional relationship there between the contractor and their surety. We talked about bonds, performance, and labor and material bonds in the last discussion. And so the contractor will have a contract with a surety if requested by the owner and included by the architect in the project manual for the contract for construction. So some of the advantage of this delivery method is that it ensures that the owner and the architect's design intent is met, right? Because before you even bid it, you have worked with the owner to ascertain their program, their goals, and worked with them to define what the project requirements are. And you record those in the contract documents that end up getting bid. So up until the moment that it's contracted, the owner and the architect have full control of the design intent. The next advantage is that it creates a competitive bidding environment for best pricing. So not every contractor is going to bid every job. They're going to bid the jobs that they feel they have the capacity to do and are qualified to do. And so, but of that pool, presumably the general contractor will assemble the best subcontract prices, and additionally, with the general contractors competing against each other, they will deliver. You will end up selecting the lowest responsible bid from a contractor. Design, bid, build also allows for the highest level of control by the owner and the architect. So the way those documents are structured is that both in design and construction, the owner and the architect have the ability to adjust as needed without affecting, as long as it doesn't affect the contractor's means and methods for construction. Some disadvantages is that in order to get the project, the contractor must be aggressive in their bidding process, and aggressive bids lead to slim profit margins. So, if you can imagine, you're trying to put together the best price possible, the lowest price possible to get the job while still making money if you're the contractor. But then going forward after they're contracted, it really encourages the contractor to take the most economical interpretation of the contract documents. And so what they will do is try and find ways that they can save money either on materials or execution methods in order to reduce their costs and maximize their profit. And in addition, unless there is a pre-qualification process or you include in part one of of each of the specification sections requirements for the subcontractors to meet minimum qualifications, it can lead to less than qualified contractors ultimately performing the work because again, if it's open to anybody and you don't have a pre-qualification process in place, you're not sure who you're going to get beforehand. The next three delivery methods are all construction management related delivery methods. And all of them have similarities and degrees in which the construction manager is involved and has responsibility toward the project. And so we're going to go through these in terms of least involved construction manager to most involved construction manager. So construction manager as advisor is where the construction manager acts only as a constructability and cost management consultant to the owner during the design and the construction process, but will not be building the building. Construction manager as advisor projects can be delivered under any method. So what's important to note that is when you have a construction manager as advisor, that's all they are doing is advising and providing advice. They actually do no heavy lifting. You can think of it as maybe an internal project manager for the owner that really has no responsibility toward the project or the project team. In addition, they really are just advising the design team and the owner in terms of constructability, cost management, and things related to being able to get that. So you could hire a construction manager as advisor and still do a design, bid, build project delivery method, or any of the other scenarios that we're talking about. And so contractually, again, all the solid lines represent agreements or contracts. And so what you can see here is that the owner will, again, contract with the architect and the owner. Or the owner will contract with the architect and the construction manager. But the owner would hold the contracts with the contractors, whether they have multiple general contractors on, say, maybe a larger job, or maybe just with the general contractor. Or I've seen owners do this and they contract directly with the subcontractors and they act as the general contractor. Some advantages of this is that less experienced owners without in-house construction capability or the time can benefit from construction managers' expertise. And then given the decision-making authority and management responsibility, a construction manager as advisor may speed up the process. And by doing that, because they can provide advice that gets quicker answers from the owner rather than, say an inexperienced owner who may not know what to do, so they want to do their own studying and homework for, a lot of the questions or recommendations that you make. The architect is accountable to the owner and protects the owner's interests still, just like design, bid, build. And the architect benefits from the construction manager's input during the design stage. So, we as architects can take advantage of that as well. A construction manager as advisor provides second-level review of construction documents. It's not to say that the architect shouldn't do their own quality control on their documents, but an extra set of eyes doesn't hurt, and so that can reduce errors and omissions, and then consequently costs due to change orders, time due to change orders, those sorts of things. And then another advantage is that clearly delineated responsibilities between all the parties lessen potential for ethical dilemmas or conflicts. So, that can, just as long as everybody knows the lane that they're in, it can really reduce some of the adversarial setup in the contracts between all three parties. There are some disadvantages to this, though. There's an added level of coordination and authority that can be confusing if you're not used to operating in this. Particularly if the construction manager is as advisor and the owner are providing conflicting information. A construction manager as advisor represents an added cost to the project. That's not a cost that it's a soft cost that's not borne anywhere else. And the CM as advisor may suppress direct communication between the owner and the architect and the contractor. Not that it would be intentional necessarily, but that, it's just another person that needs to be in the loop or in the communication chain of command. And as a result, that confusion could cause some issues with decision-making process. And since the three prime parties hold a separate contract with the owner, there is potential for adversarial relationships, increasing the likelihood of disputes. So while there are advantages, there is additional risk as well. And interestingly is that there's limited consequences for the construction manager as advisor. If the project comes in over budget or if it comes in late, they bear no responsibility for it. They just gave it bad advice, and so that's what it's chalked up to. The next is construction manager as agent, or oftentimes you see it abbreviated as CMA. This construction manager as agent provides early consulting and may act on the behalf of the owner in assembling and coordinating the construction trades prior to and during construction. The construction manager typically provide their services for a fixed fee and assume no risk for the actual construction costs themselves, but pass on both savings and overruns directly to the owner. So as an agent, they can act on the behalf of the owner in terms of, helping the owner obtain, say, geotechnical reports, surveys, preparing construction cost estimates, preparing project schedules, vetting general contractors and subcontractors to see if they're qualified to bid the project, things of that nature. And so a lot of times what they do is they will be involved both in design and construction. So they come on to the project, typically schematic design, late schematic design, early design development. And so they typically have a fee for pre-design or for their preliminary pre-construction services. And so that happens up until through bidding, and then they can be involved also during construction representing the owner. Again, they don't have skin in the game, and so if they're able to save the owner money, great, the owner benefits. If there's overruns, oops, that goes on to the owner as well. The construction or the contract setup is exactly the same as construction manager as advisor. The difference is the increased responsibility and of the construction manager as the agent, and because they act as an agent of the owner, they can also take on or act on the owner's behalf for certain things. Some advantages to this is that, again, less experienced owners would benefit from their advice. The construction manager's agent's ability to make fiscal decisions can speed up the process and reduce duplication. Again, speeding up the owner's decision-making process. Obviously, the additional construction expertise can be valuable to both the design team and the owner. A construction manager provides a second level review, just like before. There are added levels of coordination and authority that can confuse. These are disadvantages. So again, very similar, right? It's just there's another party involved, and it can add confusion. And again, it's an added cost to the project. And again, there is a communication flow that needs to be addressed beforehand as well, and that communication is really important. Otherwise, it causes confusion in the decision-making process. And just like before, there's an increased likelihood of disputes because there's yet another party involved in the project. The third construction manager scenario is construction manager as constructor. It is just like construction manager as agent, the one we just reviewed. The only difference is that this construction manager will also be the general contractor for the project they will construct the project as the general contractor. And so in some ways, they've got more skin in the game. And so you'll notice the difference in this diagram is that the subcontractor agreements have moved from the owner over to the construction manager, because now the construction manager will also manage the subcontractors. Some advantages of this is that since the construction manager makes a cost commitment early in the project, the owner has more security about the costs as they move forward. Presumably, typically the way this contract is set up for CMC is that there is some sort of fee, usually a fixed fee for pre-construction services that happen, from the time they're hired until the contract is signed with the contractor. And then there's the fee that they will propose that's typically negotiated beforehand for their overhead and profit. A lot of times you'll see that the general conditions, what can be included in the general conditions, being defined beforehand as well, because that can have a difference on where the overhead and profit is being charged on the project. Since the construction manager commits to deliver the project for a specified price, it's in their interest to complete the construction on time. So again, because they are also building it, they've got skin in the game. And so not only do they want to make sure that they hit a price that they think they can meet, but then also hit the time frame, because to avoid increasing the cost of construction. Owners with limited construction experience can benefit from the construction manager's expertise and bringing them on early. And not just the owners, the design team as well. Like other approaches, independence of the architect and the contractor make responsibility and liability relatively clear. Again, all these construction manager scenarios are still very similar to design bid build in the fact that there are separate contracts between the owner and the architect, and then the owner and the contractor. Scheduling is straightforward because the contractor is involved early. The time required to select an addition, these are some disadvantages. So you have, oftentimes the construction manager is selected much like the architect or the engineer is, where there's typically a process where they will request qualifications. They will request a fee for overhead and profit, which is usually delivered in a percent of the cost of the work, which is all the subcontracts together, plus the general conditions. And then, and so it takes time to work through that. And oftentimes, particularly with inexperienced clients, you as the architect are asked to help shepherd that process. And so it's important to be both familiar with it and how the contracts work, and then also being able to solicit an RFP for a CMC that is clear and to the best of your ability, where you can compare apples to apples. Another disadvantage is that construction manager as contractor represents an added cost. You will be paying a fee during design for that contractor's pre-construction services when compared to a traditional design bid build. However, the hope is that it will save you time and save you money going forward, because they're involved much earlier in the project. Since the owner does not contract directly with the prime or trade contractors, the owner has less control of quality during the construction process when compared to construction manager as advisor or agent. Since again, it's another party, so there could be a higher likelihood of disputes. However, you've taken a construction manager and doubled them up as the general contractor, so there's still really just two main contracts between three parties. So that's puts it closer to being more design bid build. When a construction manager as constructor is selected by low bid, change orders and delays are likely, which increase costs. So the key takeaway from that is that when you are hiring a construction manager as constructor, it's important to know that that fee is one part of it, but then presumably you're also hiring on qualifications, or you do a process before you ask for a fee that gets you to 3-5 of the most qualified contractors to provide this service and to construct the project, and then you ask for fees. And then it could add additional time to the project as a disadvantage because there's the time to do the RFP, to select the construction manager. Not that the design couldn't coincide, but you have to be careful that you don't get so far ahead that the contractor doesn't have time to provide value through their pre-construction services. Additionally, with that additional party being involved during design, they need time to be able to bid, vet, review the drawings, in addition to the owner during design as well. So that can take some additional time. The next main delivery method is design build. And design build, particularly in the past 10 years, has become something that's been very fashionable. And there are projects that it's well suited for, and there are some projects that it's just not suited for. The challenges with design build we'll go through, but there are definitely some to overcome. So this is the most straightforward diagram for design bid build. So as you can see, there's a contract between the owner and the contractor. And then the contractor contracts the design team. And so as you can see here, the design team is one party away from the owner. So not that the design team wouldn't have any contact with the owner. However, we have the architect no longer acts as an agent of the owner. So the owner is on their own. They don't have the benefit of having a design professional to help them through some of the design issues directly. Everything must be filtered through another party. So that is a real change in what a design team is used to. And it's a real change from what a contractor is used to. A contractor is not used to working through some of those design issues. And I'm speaking in gross generalizations here. Another way that this could look is that the architect and the contractor come together to create some sort of entity as two separate entities. They come together to create a design build team or design build entity that then contracts with the owner. That can help alleviate some of those issues, provided that the owner and the contractor, or the architect and the contractor have come together in some third party entity, an LLC or corporation, that is those two companies coming together and creating something else that contracts directly with the owner. So some advantages of design build. The design build team is selected based on qualifications, capabilities, experience, and price. Although oftentimes it's really just the qualifications and capabilities and experience of the prime that you typically see, and that the design team is not seen as needing qualifications because they're really executing a design that the contractor asked them to execute based on owner direction. The design and construction are performed by a single team under one contract. So there is a single source of responsibility. That's kind of nice for an owner. I mean, they have one contract that they have to worry about for the project, for the whole project. And if there's a problem, there's only one call they have to make, and that's to the design build contractor. Time can be saved under this delivery method because the contractor can work it out where they can order materials much earlier. They can say, look, we know this is what we're using because it's going to be economical. We're going to design around it, period. This is what we're going to do, so we can order stuff and get it on site. Likewise, site work can begin before the design is complete, because they're going to allocate so much money in the design build contract for site work, and we're going to move forward with it. So there definitely are some advantages in terms of reducing the time frame under design build contract. There is a close contractual relationship between the design and construction teams. So either they're part of the same company, literally part of one company. There's designers and contractors in the same firm, or they've come together to form a new team. So presumably they have worked together to reduce any issues on site and result in fewer change orders for the owner. Some disadvantages of a design build scenario is the owner does not have the security of an architect engineer to act as their agent during the project. So there's often times when where an owner may go out on site and they're like, man, I just don't think this is constructed right. Let me call my architect. Well, they can't do that under this scenario. They're contracted with a contractor typically, and so they're dealing with just the contractor. There is less assurance on the owner's part that the design team is qualified to perform the work, because they are not hiring the design team. Since the owner is not hiring the design team, they're not really sure who's working on it, and if they've ever done a project of that type, scale, complexity, whatever the case may be. And so they have less control and say over that. And so as a result, the owner will lose some control of the design process as a result. Some more disadvantages is the contractor is given more flexibility during design. So whatever the owner loses, the contractor picks up. There can be less competition among contractors. A design builder will say, well, I will build it for this amount, and just as long as they're the lowest amount, that means they can pick whomever they want under that scenario to construct for subcontractors to construct the project. And so there's less clarity from the owner's side on how those monies get broken out and who's responsible for what, and what that really looks like. The construction contract administration requires more collaboration, and really, this is a big deal. It requires more experience on the owner's part, because it sets up a scenario, because they don't have anybody acting on their behalf, where the contractor could be preparing or constructing work that wouldn't meet the specification standards that you would typically see, or may not meet code, or also a whole host of things, because they don't have a design professional to act as their agent. Some ways to overcome some of those disadvantages, though, in a design build delivery method is to do design build with bridging. So the contract diagram looks exactly like the previous one, only you can tell up here with the owner, they also have an additional consultant. And so this additional consultant is usually called the bridging architect or bridging design team. So where this has real value is if you are, let's say, this is a real scenario. This came up. So the city of St. Louis was building a new family courts facility. And so they were going to use design build. And after a lot of discussions between the design community and the city of St. Louis, they opted to go with a design build with a bridging architect. And the reason why they decided to do that is because, this was a massive project. I think it was somewhere between like 80 and $100 million construction project, right? And a family courts facility is a very specific project type. That's not something that just any architect can pick up and run with and execute well. You really need a design team that knows courts facilities, and particularly during the design phase. Now, having said that, once the design and the trajectory is set for the project, you can use a design build team then from that point forward to be the design team of record and to construct it. And so that's the method that they chose to do, where they hired this bridging architect, which basically takes the design and the drawings up through, say, maybe 50% design development, maybe full design development level. And then they hand that information over to the design build team. The design build team then executes the final contract documents for the project and constructs it. And so the advantage there is that, if you can imagine that here, I'll do it this way, the involvement of the bridging architect is substantial at first and then narrows as the project continues on, and particularly as it goes in through construction. But they can be brought in at critical intervals to ensure compliance with, say, court regulations or whatever. Make sure that the design intent that the owner has requested from the beginning gets executed both through the architect of records drawings as well as under construction. And so, the bridging architect is typically then just selected based on their qualifications. And then the design build team is selected based on price. So you get kind of the best of both worlds and kind of mitigates the owner's risk. But again, the design of record, right, and the construction are performed by a single team, and then that way there's a single source of responsibility. Again, close contractual relationship between the design of record and construction teams, hopefully resulting in fewer change orders. And then the bridging architect allows the owner to have more control over design. Very similar disadvantages to the previous. The owner does not have the security of that the AE is acting as their agent during the project, and it really depends on the scope of the bridging architect during construction. Typically, it's extremely limited role. The contractor is given some flexibility in design. Really their influence is going to be early on in terms of costs and making sure that they can deliver for the price that they agreed to. And then again, the competition among contractors is reduced, and you really need more experience on the owner's part in order to execute the construction. I'm going to take a drink here. This last delivery method is integrated project delivery, or IPD. Now, this is very similar to the acronym for the Intern Development Program, or IDP. So if I mess up and say IDP instead of IPD going forward, I apologize. IDP is was the precursor to AXP, which is your intern experience to become a licensed architect. So if I screw that up during this, I apologize. But integrated project delivery is a relatively new delivery method, and this is born out of the fact that all of these other delivery methods have some inherent problems with them, and most of those problems deal with coming in over budget, coming in past time, and increased litigation. And so what IPD's intent is to bridge the divide between the design and construction to improve communication, better coordinate the documents, and increase collaboration. So there are some 10 fundamental IPD principles that I think are important to keep in mind. The first is that there's got to be mutual respect and trust among all the parties. Why? Because there's going to be mutual benefit and reward among the parties. And so that is an important thing to keep in mind, is that everybody's going to benefit, so or pay the price. And so it's important that there's some respect and trust there. And it's also important that the risks are identified and accepted very early on in the project for all the parties. It allows for collaborative innovation and decision making. So by the intent of the IPD is to be more collaborative among all the parties involved, the owner, the design team, and the contractor, and give everybody some decision-making authority going through the whole thing. The next principle is that there's early involvement by all the key parties. And that's really key to make sure that everybody's plugged in and knows that they're plugged in early on the project and are involved, so that they all understand where the early goal definition happens, what the goals are for the project, and make sure everybody's focused on that. So really, these first principles are really focused on making sure that the project comes first, not any of the individual parties. The next IPD principle is intensified planning. So what happens is, because you've got so many more folks involved, the planning for the project really consumes more time. Why? Because you're dealing with more information. You're dealing with more decision-making folks. You're dealing with more alternatives in ways that you can address the project needs, which ultimately the project benefits from. The end result is better, but it does take more time. Open communication is important. It's really important that nobody's excluded from these discussions, and that everybody's involved, and that there's no side conversations that would be detrimental to the relationship, because that would not create mutual respect and trust. You've got to make sure that there is appropriate technology, and specifically, this has been this project delivery method probably wouldn't be possible if it weren't for BIM. If it weren't for building information modeling, there probably would not be. I don't think IPD would be nearly as successful, because it really does allow for better exchange of materials and information. And then lastly is that there's clear organization and leadership, and know that at different points in the project there may be different project leaders. So it's not just one person throughout the whole project, but rather a shifting of responsibilities based on the phase that the project is at. So there are three main IPD structures. The first is transitional forms. The second is multi-party agreements. And the third is single-purpose entity. So transitional forms are modeled after existing construction manager agreements and offer a comfortable first step for integrated project delivery. So it really looks like CMC, or construction manager, as constructor. However, the difference is that there's mutual indemnification, and there is a different set of general conditions. So and there's a different set of contract documents. So while the contract lines remain the same, the contents of what happens in those lines, or the contracts, is different. Because again, there's mutual indemnification and a higher level of collaboration and cooperation that's implied and explicit in those contracts. And they're governed by a general conditions, but it's a different general conditions. It's the A295. And so this is really, it's a whole different set of contract documents, again, with different requirements, right, for those relationships, which is intended to create different behaviors, like we talked about in that very first slide. The next is multi-party agreement. It's a single agreement that the parties can use to sign and construct a project using integrated project delivery. There is nothing else, no other delivery method that's like this. The owner, the architect, and the contractor all come together and sign one agreement. It's kind of mind-blowing that it's kind of a simple, elegant solution, in the fact that, really, okay, rather than all these separate contracts, we're all just going to sign one, and it defines what each of our responsibilities are. But it also allows us to perform to the best of our ability and the best of our talents on the project. It is still guided by the same general conditions, the A295. The third form of IPD is single purpose entity. This creates an LLC, or a whole separate entity, for the purpose, the sole purpose, of planning, designing, and constructing the project. This allows for complete sharing of risk and reward in a fully integrated process. And so I think that's really important to note. And so all these parties are now in the same boat, right? They're in the same company, and they are single party entity that's defined by a contract called C195. And then, because they're typically an LLC, you can have these non-organizational members, right? Because remember, LLCs don't have owners or shareholders, they have members. So you can have these non-organizational members that can then contract, and there's a separate contract document for those relationships as well. So some IPD benefits to the owner. There's some predictability, right? There's some predictability in terms of the outcomes, because you spend a lot of time planning them. You spend a lot of time coordinating them. There are very few surprises, because presumably everybody has done their job and everything is executed according to plan. There should be reduced risks for very much the same reasons. There should be an improved experience by the owner, both during design and construction. It gives the owner greater flexibility, both during design and the construction of the project, because everybody knows that the project comes first, and so that's where they know they can kind of use that to make decisions off of, as well as their own needs and goals for the project. And presumably, that creates greater value. Greater value does not mean less expensive. It means more value. And so it may mean that it costs more than some of the other delivery methods, but the benefits far outweigh those additional dollars. There are some definite IPD benefits to an architect. We are still asked to design and lead that design process. We have the capability to lead collaborative teams, particularly during design. We have early access to subcontractors. So there's a lot of times during design when you're just like, gosh, if I could just talk to the guy who's going to build it and see if he'd rather have the detail this way or that way, let's talk through it rather than waiting for him to bid it and then fight about it later. You have access to subcontractors to really get their thoughts on some of these things. You've got time, or you've got the ability to develop, analyze, and evaluate decisions very quickly, because everybody's in the room, right? The room. Everybody's working on the same team, and so you can analyze and make decisions much faster. Makes it easier to analyze alternatives, right? Because you're like, man, we could do it this way, or we could do it this way. I wonder which way is going to be most cost effective, or which way is going to be quicker to build, or which materials are more readily available. Well, you can have those alternatives explored very quickly by your contractor. you can better address life cycle issues. A lot of times we're asked questions about, well, gosh, do I want to go with that more efficient system? I mean, or the higher performing glass? I mean, yeah, it's great. It sounds great, but it's going to be so many more initial dollars. What's my real payback? Well, then you can really work with the contractor on what those initial costs are and then be able to project in a life cycle costing scenario much quicker. There's reduced risk for us and a better likelihood for high performance buildings. And there are some IPD benefits to the contractor as well, because they have influence early. They have influence over the construction schedule, the costs, all those sorts of things. And so they're better able to provide an advisory role on those items. They have a better understanding of the project goals. Just because you've had all these conversations with the owner, in a design bid build scenario, that doesn't mean the contractor understands that. Even if you tell them, they're never going to understand it to the level that you and the owner have discussed it and understand it. And so by having the contractor on board early, it makes it easier for them to make value judgments when they need to on the field. It can eliminate change orders because everybody has vetted all these things much earlier on. And there is a less adversarial relationship with the owner and less adversarial relationship with the architect during construction. And so really it's intended to bring everybody together as one team. Now, that's not to say that everything's rosy in IPD. There are some challenges. You've got to have an owner that's completely committed to this, and it also means that they're willing to share the risk and the reward with the design team and the contractor. It also means that there are expanded roles and boundaries, which may mean you may have a contractor advising the design team on how to design. It also means that you may have the design team advising the contractor on means and methods. Because you're indemnifying each other in the contract, you have the latitude to do that. But it also means that you need to be willing to be collaborative, be a team player, listen to the advice of your teammates, and be able to incorporate that into the design. It's really focused on collaboration, which means you've got to put aside the do-it-yourself attitude, which is difficult for some design team members and owners and contractors too. But there's really no place in IPD for egos. It's really a place where you've got to set those aside because the first priority is not you, not your company, but the project. There are some legal issues with this. While there are contract documents, there's not a whole lot of court testing on these documents. And so that means that you've got to be very clear and concise, both in the language in the documents and in conversations in putting together IPD team to make sure that everybody's comfortable with the approach and has a full understanding of the approach. And then there are some insurance issues as well. Because it's relatively new, some insurers, particularly professional liability insurers or your E&O insurance, may have a problem with pursuing a project like this because it is new, it's not tested, and so in some ways it's very difficult for them to know how to insure it or if all of the language is insurable. So that's really important distinction and thing to look at too. And it may have some implications on the contractor side or the owner side that I'm just not aware of because I'm not a contractor or typically not a building owner. So when we meet on Monday, we'll go through any questions you might have on any of these delivery methods. But really, this is one of these things where there's variations on all of these methods, but really these are the primary ways. And the reason why they're the primary ways is because there are contracts or agreements that define these relationships. And as a result, each of these contracts incite certain behaviors. And so there are good things and bad things about all of them, but that's the important thing to remember. So thanks, and we'll see you Monday.